Every shot fired tells a tale. Subscribe today and uncover the legends of the Wild West. The year was 1865, and the high desert of New Mexico Territory lay under a burning sky. Dust swept across the plains, coating everything in the pale red of the earth. In the small settlement of Socorro, a child was born into a world where the rule of the gun outweighed the rule of law. His name was Elfego Baca, and though no one could have known it at the time, this boy would one day grow into a figure whispered about in saloons and sung of in corridos across the Southwest. Elfego's parents were of Mexican heritage, descendants of the long history that tied New Mexico more closely to Mexico than to the United States. Life for such families was never easy after the U.S. had annexed the territory. In towns like Socorro, Anglo settlers arrived with money, cattle, and guns, often looking down on their Mexican neighbors as second-class citizens. Injustice was not rare, it was daily bread. As a child, Elfego learned early that the world was divided between those who held power and those who endured it. He would watch his father haggle at the marketplace with ranchers who sneered at his accent, his clothes, his very existence. He would see neighbors turned out of their homes when land disputes arose, always settled in favor of those who spoke English and carried influence. The boy did not yet have the words for it, but he understood one thing with a clarity beyond his years. The weak had no protector. One story that stayed with him all his life happened when he was only 9. A band of drunken cowboys rode into Socorro late one evening, their spurs clinking and their laughter sharp as broken glass. They singled out a Mexican store owner, accusing him of cheating on weights. Without trial or sheriff, they dragged him into the street. Elfego, standing with his mother, clutched her hand as he saw the man beaten, blood spilling onto the dust while onlookers turned away in silence. "Why doesn't someone stop them?" Elfego whispered. His mother pulled him close, her voice trembling. "Because no one dares, mijo." That night, the boy could not sleep. He replayed the scene in his mind, the helplessness, the smirks of the cowboys, the way the victim's eyes pleaded with the crowd and found no help. Something hardened inside him. He swore to himself that if he ever had the chance, he would never stand silent. As he grew, Elfego developed a toughness that set him apart. Small in stature, he was wiry and quick, with sharp eyes that missed little. He loved stories of Mexican heroes, rebels, soldiers, and lawmen who had stood against impossible odds. While other boys bragged about horses or girls, Elfego spoke of honor and justice. To his friends he said, "A man's worth is not in the size of his gun, but in what he's willing to fight for." By his teenage years, he was already carrying himself with the air of someone older. He worked odd jobs around Socorro, herding, delivering supplies, even helping out in the courthouse, always watching, always learning. The courthouse in particular fascinated him. There he saw the machinery of law, the way words on paper could mean life or death, land or poverty. Yet he also saw how the system bent against his people. He decided then that law, like a weapon, was something that could be wielded, and he would learn to wield both. It was around this time that Elfego had his first brush with real violence. He was 14 when a group of boys, Anglo sons of ranchers, cornered him near the riverbank. They mocked his accent, pushed him, tried to make him kneel. But Elfego, fiery and stubborn, refused. A fight broke out. He was smaller, outnumbered, but he fought like a wildcat, refusing to give them the satisfaction of submission. When he staggered home, face bruised and lip bleeding, his father did not scold him. Instead, he said, "Bueno, hijo, better to bleed with dignity than live with shame." Those words carved themselves deep into Elfego's soul. By the time he was 19, Elfego had already earned a reputation in Socorro as someone not easily cowed. He dressed sharply when he could, carried himself with confidence, and spoke with conviction. Some Anglo townsfolk dismissed him as arrogant, but among his fellow Mexican-Americans whispers began, "Ese muchacho, he will be our protector. Opportunity came in 1884 when Elfego met Sheriff Ross Mills, a man looking for deputies to help bring order to Catron County, a rugged stretch of land plagued by cattle rustlers, drunken cowboys, and feuds that often ended in shallow graves. Mills saw something in the young Elfego, some spark of determination beyond his years. Despite the doubts of others, "He's just a boy, and a Mexican one at that." Mills handed him a deputy's badge. For Elfego, it was not just a piece of tin, it was the embodiment of his childhood vow. That small star-shaped badge was his chance to finally stand against the lawlessness and injustice he had witnessed since boyhood. He pinned it to his chest with pride, as if it were a shield against all the wrongs of the frontier. Yet with the badge came danger. Every saloon in the county buzzed with the news. A young Mexican deputy was strutting around with authority. To the cowboys who thrived on intimidation, it was an insult. To Elfego, it was a challenge he welcomed. As he walked the dusty streets of Catron County towns for the first time in uniform, townsfolk stared. Some smiled, some scoffed, but Elfego kept his head high. In his heart, he could still hear his mother's words, "Because no one dares." Now, at 19, Elfego Baca dared, and the world was about to find out just how dangerous a man like that could be. The year was 1884, and the frontier townships of Catron County were teetering on the edge of chaos. Law existed in name, but in practice, justice belonged to whoever could pull the trigger first. Saloons roared with drunken laughter, poker games ended with pistols drawn, and ranch disputes were often settled with blood. Into this volatile world stepped a 19-year-old with a sharp suit, a determined gaze, and a tin badge pinned to his chest. Deputy Elfego Baca. Sheriff Ross Mills had taken a gamble when he swore in the young man. To most of the Anglo ranchers, it was a joke. "A Mexican kid wearing a badge? What's he gonna do, throw tortillas at us?" One cowboy scoffed at the bar, but Mills had seen something different. Beneath Elfego's slim frame and youthful face, there was a fire that most men twice his age lacked. Elfego himself knew the odds were stacked against him. Every time he walked the boardwalk of a frontier town, eyes followed him, some with suspicion, others with open hostility. But he carried himself with confidence, his revolver holstered low, his dark eyes sharp and unyielding. He had learned long ago that weakness invited cruelty. Now, with the badge on his chest, he intended to show everyone that law and respect did not come from skin color, but from resolve. The saloon confrontation. His first real test came not long after his appointment. One hot afternoon, Elfego entered a dusty saloon in reserve to break up a fight between two drunken cowboys. The men were shouting over a poker game, fists clenched around bottles of whiskey. "Sheriff ain't here, boy," one of them sneered when Elfego stepped forward. "So why don't you run back home before you get hurt?" Elfego's hand hovered near his revolver, not drawing it, but making sure the men noticed. His voice was calm, but edged with steel. "I'm not here to play. Put the bottles down, or I'll put you down." The room went silent. The cowboys stared at the teenager in disbelief, then burst out laughing. One lunged forward, raising a bottle. Faster than the eye could follow, Elfego drew his pistol and fired, a single shot that shattered the glass bottle just inches from the man's hand. The cowboy froze, eyes wide as the bottle exploded into shards. Elfego didn't flinch. He kept the revolver steady, his voice even. "The next shot doesn't miss." The men backed off, muttering curses, but they knew they had been bested. For the first time, the saloon saw that this Mexican kid wasn't all talk. Word spread quickly. Elfego Baca was not to be trifled with. A protector of the people. What set Elfego apart was not just his bravery, but whom he chose to protect. Most deputies of the time enforced law selectively, often siding with wealthy ranchers and Anglo settlers. Elfego, however, earned the trust of the Mexican villagers who had long been ignored or abused. He walked their dusty streets at night, shared meals in their modest homes, and listened to their grievances. One old farmer told him, "We've never had a lawman who saw us as people, Hijo. You are different." To them, Elfego became more than just a deputy. He was a symbol, a man from their own community standing tall against those who would treat them as less than human. But symbols invite enemies. The brewing storm. The Anglo cowboys who ruled the saloons and ranches of Catron County didn't take kindly to Elfego's rise. Rumors swirled that he was too bold, that he didn't know his place. Some mocked him openly, others plotted quietly. Among them was Charlie McCarty, a rough and reckless cowboy whose gang terrorized the Frisco area. McCarty was known for his temper and his hatred of Mexicans. To him, Elfego's badge was an insult, a direct challenge to cowboy supremacy. "You hear about that pup Baca?" McCarty spat to his men one evening, slamming his drink down. "Walking around like he owns the place, protecting greasers like they're worth something. I'll put him in the dirt myself." The tension was palpable. The stage was being set for a showdown larger than Elfego could have imagined. Elfego's philosophy. Despite the threats, Elfego held to a simple code. He told those who questioned his boldness, "A badge means nothing if you're afraid to wear it. If law doesn't protect everyone, it protects no one." It was a radical idea in a land where law often meant the strong keeping the weak in their place. Elfego's defiance wasn't just about keeping order, it was about redefining what justice could mean in the New Mexico territory. Foreshadowing the legend one night, as Elfego patrolled the outskirts of town, he paused under the starlit sky. Coyotes howled in the distance, and the desert air was cool against his face. He thought of his mother's words years ago. "Because no one dares." Now he dared, but daring came with a price. The cowboys were watching, waiting. His name was already a curse in their mouths. It was only a matter of time before a spark lit the powder keg. And that spark would come soon, in the small settlement of Frisco, where 40 armed men would test the courage of one young deputy. A battle was coming, one that would last 33 hours and carve Elfego Baca's name into legend. By the autumn of 1884, whispers of Elfego Baca's defiance had spread across the New Mexico territory. To Mexican villagers, he was a guardian who carried himself with pride in a world that offered them little dignity. To the Anglo cowboys, he was a thorn in their side, a brash boy who had no business wearing a badge. Those tensions, simmering for months, finally found their boiling point in a small settlement called Frisco, a place destined to be remembered for blood and gunpowder. Frisco was little more than a scattering of wooden shacks, an adobe house or two, and a saloon that never closed. It was a cowboy town through and through, filled with cattle hands who worked hard, drank harder, and considered the law an inconvenient suggestion. The McCarty gang often rode there, drunk and mean, and when they did, the townsfolk stayed inside and prayed for silence. One cold evening, Elfego arrived in Frisco. He had come to investigate complaints that the cowboys had been terrorizing the local Mexican residents, shoving them from sidewalks, insulting their wives, and beating men who dared talk back. Word traveled quickly that the young deputy was in town. By the time he stepped into the main street, boots crunching in the dust, half the saloon knew, and so did Charlie McCarty. Inside the saloon, the air was thick with smoke and cheap whiskey. McCarty and his men were gathered around a table, voices loud, laughter mean. When Elfego pushed the door open, silence fell. The piano player stopped. Every eye turned to the slim figure in the doorway, the star-shaped badge catching the dim light. Elfego didn't flinch. He walked straight to the bar, ordered a glass of water, and then turned, his voice cutting through the tension. "Which one of you tried to whip an old man in the street last night?" For a moment, no one answered. Then McCarty leaned back, grinning with a mouth full of yellow teeth. "That old greaser. He was in my way. Ain't no law against teaching them their place." Elfego's gaze never left him. There's law against cruelty, and as long as I wear this badge, I'll enforce it." The saloon erupted in laughter, but there was an edge to it, like knives drawn in the dark. McCarty slammed his fist on the table. "You think you can come here, boy, and tell us how to treat them? You and your little badge?" Elfego's voice was calm, steady. "If you want to push people around, start with me." The challenge hung in the air. McCarty rose, towering over him, hand twitching near his pistol. For a heartbeat, everyone thought the gunfight would explode right there. But Elfego didn't move, didn't blink. Something in his stillness unsettled even McCarty. Instead, the cowboy spat at the floor and growled, "Your time's coming, deputy. We'll see how tough you really are." Elfego left the saloon knowing full well he had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The cowboys would not let the insult stand. He could have ridden out of Frisco that night, left the town to its fear. But that wasn't his way. He chose to stay, to show the villagers that the badge meant something. The next morning, tension snapped. McCarty and his gang stormed into town, drunk on whiskey and rage, waving pistols. They cornered a Mexican laborer near the corral, shoving him against the fence. Elfego was there in moments, stepping between the man and the mob. The cowboys sneered, their hands itching for blood. "If you want him," Elfego said, "you'll have to go through me." The villagers who had gathered held their breath. No one had ever stood against the gang like this. The cowboys muttered threats, and McCarty finally barked, "Fine, boy. You want to play sheriff? We'll bury you like one." That night, Elfego took shelter in a small adobe house on the edge of the town, owned by a Mexican family who begged him to flee. But Elfego shook his head. "If I leave, they win. If I stay, maybe they'll learn." He checked his pistol, laid out his ammunition, and waited. Outside, darkness settled over Frisco. The first shots came just before dawn. A bullet slammed into the adobe wall with a crack, then another and another. Shouts echoed in the morning chill as dozens of cowboys surrounded the house. Windows shattered, wood splintered, and dust filled the air. The siege of Frisco had begun. From inside, Elfego returned fire with calm precision. Every shot he fired had to count. He couldn't waste a single bullet. He moved from window to window, keeping the attackers guessing. Hours stretched into the afternoon, the sun blazing overhead as the gunfire roared. Townsfolk hid behind shutters, peeking out in awe and terror. The cowboys had come expecting an easy kill. Instead, they found themselves facing a man who refused to fall, no matter how many bullets they sent his way. Rumor later claimed that more than 4,000 rounds were fired into that little adobe house. Holes pocked the walls, doors were shattered, yet somehow the deputy inside remained alive. For 33 hours the fight raged, a storm of lead and fury. Cowboys cursed his name, daring him to come out, but every time one of them ventured too close, Elfego's gun barked, and another man fell. By nightfall, whispers crept even into the hearts of his enemies. Maybe the boy cannot be killed. What had begun as an act of defiance was turning into something else entirely. In that small house in Frisco, under relentless fire, Elfego Baca was being transformed from a stubborn deputy into a legend, and the night was still young. The adobe walls rattled as another wave of bullets hammered against them. Dust rained from the ceiling, choking the air, but Elfego Baca stayed steady, his revolver in hand, eyes sharp as a hawk's. Outside, the cowboys shouted curses, their voices hoarse from rage and whiskey, but beneath the bravado, fear had begun to creep into their tones. They had expected to burn him out, to kill the boy who had dared defy them. Yet, as the hours stretched into the second day, the truth gnawed at their courage. Elfego Baca would not fall. At first, the gang had tried to storm the house, charging up to the windows and doors in drunken fury. But each time a shot rang out from inside and one of them tumbled lifeless into the dust. Word spread quickly through the mob. Getting too close meant death. So they changed tactics, keeping their distance, pouring endless fire into the adobe walls in hopes of wearing him down. Bullets punched through plaster, ricocheted off furniture, whined across the room like angry hornets. The family who had sheltered Elfego huddled in terror, whispering prayers. He reassured them with a calmness that seemed impossible. "Stay low. The walls are strong. They won't take me alive." By noon of the first day, the street outside looked like a battlefield. Smoke hung heavy, the acrid smell of gunpowder coating every breath. Horses stamped nervously, tied to posts, their ears flicking at each crack of gunfire. The villagers dared not intervene, but from behind shuttered windows they watched in awe. They had never seen anyone defy the McCarty gang for more than a few minutes, let alone hours. Elfego had already become a symbol, even if he didn't know it yet. Inside, the young deputy's world shrank to the rhythm of survival. Reload, aim, fire. Move positions to confuse them. Sip water when his throat burned dry. He counted his bullets with care, every shot measured, every pull of the trigger a promise that he was still alive. When hunger gnawed, he ignored it. When fatigue pulled at his limbs, he forced himself awake. The house itself seemed to fight beside him, its thick adobe walls absorbing thousands of rounds without collapsing. Later, people would say it was a miracle. Others would say it was fate. To Elfego, it was simply endurance. As the night fell on the first day, lanterns flickered outside, casting ghostly shadows on the street. The cowboys huddled, frustrated, muttering about dynamite, about setting the house on fire. But even their bravado had limits. Each time someone crept close with a torch, a gunshot rang out from the darkness within, sending them scrambling back. Elfego seemed less like a man and more like a spirit haunting the house, unseen yet deadly. The second day dawned, and still the siege dragged on. The cowboys, numbering nearly 80 at their height, had begun to argue among themselves. How could one man hold out so long? Some swore he had help inside, others claimed he had stashed enough guns and ammo for an army. The truth was simpler. Elfego had only his revolvers, a Winchester, and the will to survive. What he lacked in firepower he made up for in cunning. He shifted firing positions constantly, sometimes shooting from a hole in the roof, sometimes from the front door, keeping the attackers guessing and paranoid. By mid-morning, tempers had frayed. The gang tried again to storm the building, sending a rush of men across the open ground. Gunfire cracked from inside. One cowboy spun and fell, clutching his chest. Another dropped to his knees before collapsing face first into the dirt. The survivors dragged themselves back, swearing. By then, at least 4 of their number were dead, and many more wounded. Yet Elfego remained untouched. The longer the fight stretched, the more the legend grew. Rumors spread to nearby towns that a lone deputy was holding off an army of cowboys. Mexican villagers whispered his name with reverence, while even Anglo settlers shook their heads in disbelief. Some compared him to the Alamo defenders, others to Wild West heroes of dime novels. For Elfego himself, there was no glory, only the endless grind of endurance, each bullet another chance to live a little longer. As dusk fell on the second day, the cowboys made one last desperate push. They poured fire into the house until the walls smoked, then hurled burning rags onto the roof. Flames licked at the edges, smoke curling upward. Inside, Elfego smothered the sparks with blankets and dirt, coughing through the haze but refusing to surrender. When the smoke cleared and he fired again from the window, the mob broke. The bravado that had fueled them for 33 hours drained away, replaced by disbelief and exhaustion. By the time the gunfire finally fell silent, the streets of Frisco were littered with broken glass, bullet casings, and the wounded pride of 80 cowboys. They slunk away in shame, their numbers reduced, their spirits shattered. The townsfolk emerged slowly, cautiously like survivors after a storm. They stared at the bullet-riddled adobe house, scarcely able to believe that anyone could still be alive inside. Then the door creaked open, and Elfego Baca stepped out. Dust clung to his clothes, his face was streaked with smoke, but he walked tall, revolver at his side, eyes blazing with the quiet fire of victory. Not a single bullet had touched him. To some, it seemed divine. To others, uncanny. To all, it was unforgettable. In that moment, Elfego Baca ceased to be just a deputy sheriff. He became a legend, the boy who had stood alone against an army and survived. Word of the 33-hour gunfight would travel far beyond Frisco, shaping his destiny and cementing his place in the mythology of the West. But for Elfego himself, standing in the aftermath of shattered walls and spent cartridges, it was simpler. He had done his duty, he had stood his ground, and he had proven, beyond any doubt, that courage could outlast fear. When the dust finally settled over Frisco, the silence felt heavier than the storm of gunfire that had raged for more than a day. The adobe house still stood, scarred with bullet holes like open wounds, yet unbroken, much like the man who had sheltered within its walls. Elfego Baca emerged into the morning light, his boots crunching on shattered glass and spent cartridges, his face smudged with soot, but his eyes calm, steady, alive. Around him, townsfolk watched in awe. For 33 hours they had listened to the ceaseless thunder of rifles, expecting each moment to be his last. Yet here he was, not only alive but standing tall, as if death itself had recoiled from his defiance. The cowboys had slunk away under cover of darkness, dragging their wounded, abandoning their dead. The McCarty gang, once feared across the New Mexico territory, had been humbled by a 19-year-old deputy with nothing but grit, a badge, and a Winchester. To the villagers of Frisco, particularly the Mexican families who had long lived under the shadow of intimidation, Elfego was no longer just a man. He was a guardian, proof that justice could stand against chaos, even when the odds seemed impossible. But victory brought with it consequences. Within days, Elfego was arrested, accused of murder for the cowboys he had gunned down. He did not protest as shackles closed around his wrists. He knew the law demanded its ritual, and he trusted in the truth of what had happened. The trials that followed became as legendary as the shootout itself. Courtrooms filled with curious spectators, whispers echoing through the galleries. Witnesses testified how Elfego had fired only in defense, how the cowboys had sworn to kill him, how the streets of Frisco had echoed with their drunken boasts before the first shot was fired. Again and again, juries acquitted him. The charges dissolved like smoke, and each acquittal only added another layer to his growing legend. Newspapers across the Southwest picked up the story, branding him too tough to kill. Dime novelists turned his defiance into near myth. Some swore he had been shielded by saints, others claimed the bullets had passed clean through without touching flesh. Elfego himself never encouraged such tales, but he did not deny them either. In the world of the frontier, a reputation could be as powerful as a six-shooter. In the years that followed, Elfego's path wound far beyond Frisco. He studied law and became an attorney, representing those who could not defend themselves. His sharp mind, combined with his fearlessness, earned him respect in courtrooms just as his courage had in dusty streets. Later, he served as a detective, a sheriff, even a U.S. Marshal. Presidents knew his name, and political figures sought his counsel. Yet, no matter how far his career carried him, the story of Frisco was never far behind. People would stop him on the street, asking if it was true he had fought off 80 men alone. He would smile and shrug, deflecting with humor. It wasn't that many, he sometimes said, though the glint in his eyes betrayed the pride he carried. In truth, Elfego understood something deeper, that the legend was no longer just his. It belonged to every Mexican-American who saw in him a champion, to every townsman who longed for justice in a lawless land, to every child who needed proof that one person could stand against many and survive. The Frisco Shootout shaped more than just his reputation. It shaped New Mexico itself. In a territory divided by race, wealth, and power, Elfego's defiance became a rallying point. He had proven that courage was not bound by skin color or status, that a poor Mexican boy could face down the deadliest outlaws and walk away alive. His story rippled through communities, carried on the tongues of storytellers, etched into the identity of a land still carving its place in the American frontier. As the years passed, Elfego aged but never softened. Even in old age he carried himself with the same fire, the same unshakable will. He lived to see New Mexico become a state, to see his people claim a stronger voice in its destiny. And through it all, the legend endured. Children grew up hearing of the 33-hour gunfight, of the bullets that could not kill him, of the man who had turned a forgotten adobe house into a fortress of justice. When he finally passed in 1945, at the age of 80, Elfego Baca left behind more than just a life. He left behind a myth. At his funeral, friends and strangers alike gathered, sharing stories of his fearlessness, his wit, his unyielding sense of honor. Some remembered him as a lawyer, others as a lawman, but all remembered him as the boy who had once stood alone against an army and survived. Today, his name still echoes in the canyons of New Mexico, in the cracked adobe ruins and sun-baked streets of the frontier. The legend of Elfego Baca is not just about one man's survival. It is about the unbreakable spirit of a people who refused to bow to fear. His story is a reminder that sometimes the greatest battles are not won by numbers, but by the sheer will of one person who refuses to fall. And so, when people speak of Elfego Baca, they do not simply recall a deputy sheriff. They recall a legend, a man too tough to kill, whose 33-hour stand in Frisco carved his name into the heart of the Wild West forever.